Hello and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm sorry, I left a light in the background there. Hold on. There we go. Let's try that again. Should have looked at that before the broadcast started. Anyways, welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede. Of course, we are broadcasting to you live from BC's northern capital. If you're listening to this later, do be sure to like and share and just keep the good word going out there. Of course, this is the Western Standard, and we are independent. We don't take any government money. So if you'd like to support us, please take out a subscription online, follow us on Facebook, or follow us on YouTube. And again, share, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Opening statement this morning, kind of along the lines of the Governor General that's just been appointed. So that's Mary Simon. And Canada has a new Governor General just in time for the federal election that is due to come down in August, possibly the fall or September. But the rumors that I'm hearing is that it'll come down in August. I happen to have a pretty good pulse on that one. I was worried for a little while regarding the integrity of our Constitution if a new Governor General was not located before the election was called. Now that Mary Simon has been named our vice-regal representative, Trudeau can go on to regain his majority. Again, I'm sure that that doesn't sound like welcome news to some people, but the fact of the matter is that I think that the Trudeau Liberals are going to win again and win with a majority. They're not going to be in minority territory anymore. The NDP is weak. The Bloc de Québécois is going to shuffle around a little bit, but they've been supporting the Liberals through and through anyways. And the Tories are divided. And not looking like the most unified anti-liberal force on the planet, to the point where it looks like they're just, 20 years behind the Liberals in all their policies. I don't think the Tories are going to do very well, to be honest with you. So that might not sound great, but let's move on to this question of, Trudeau's first move to retake Lajavan is naming an Inuk woman as the head of our government on behalf of, or the head of our state, to be clear, head of state. Vice-regal head of state, on behalf of our dear old queen. And Mary Simon is a well-accomplished person. She represents clearly a pivot by Justin Trudeau and his government back to the progressives to try and get them to support them during this re-election. This is an important understanding. This is something that we have to concede that the Liberals have always done better than the Conservatives. How exactly, I'm not sure. I think that Borden and McDonald, and for that matter, Diefenbaker, and in some ways Mulroney, and certainly Harper tried. They did do these symbolic moves that help capture the imagination of a nation, at least for a moment. But the Liberals are just so much better at it than us. And this is one of the places where they are. So we've had all these conversations about residential schools, the unmarked graves, etc. And what do the Liberals do? They seize upon the opportunity. The Conservatives are still playing. They're still playing defense. They're still trying to justify the residential school question while also fighting about whether or not the graves were really unmarked or discovered. They've completely lost the initiative in the conversation. They could stand on principle around, say, well, you can't just tear down statues. You can't just erase our history. And there were actually positive things that came out of the residential school system. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of those schools were actually asked for by the local First Nations because they too knew that they would not survive as a people group inside of non-Aboriginal, post-contact, industrialized civilization. It wasn't going to happen. If they couldn't read, they couldn't write, and they couldn't do sums, they would not be able to survive. And they knew that. Did everybody ask for it? No. Did terrible things happen? Yes. Did they happen everywhere all the time? No. Should the people who did them be hunted down and prosecuted? And again, I'd prefer some capital punishment, but we got rid of that a long time ago. Yes, they should be. Not a question. But until someone says that clearly on the Conservative side, they're just stuck sounding completely tone deaf. Meanwhile, the Liberals have moved past this conversation, and now they've got a positive spin to it. Oh yeah, there are all those terrible things that happened the other week. We're sorry about that. Haven't solved any of it. Haven't brought fresh water. Haven't to the reserves. Haven't fixed the murdering and missing things that happen, along the highway of tears when young women and girls are murdered and are taken and are never found again. None of that's been solved. But you know what we did solve? We have brought in somebody to be a token as our vice-regal representative. Isn't that significant? So this is a pivot back to progressives and people who kind of pay attention to that sort of thing. To be clear, and I'm about to say this in the opening statement, I don't think Mary Simon's a bad choice. But that is kind of the role she's being asked to play in this time of panic. She is Trudeau's first step to re-election. That's what's going on there. So Governor General Mary Simon, is not actually a full-blood Inuk, is how you say that. So Inuit is the plural and Inuk is the singular. Though I've never really understood that one, because Inuk means just person or one, and Inuit means people. So, I mean, it'd be kind of like us calling ourselves people or person, not Canadian or Canadians or Canadian. It's like, I'm a person and we are people, but I just say it in a ethnic language that would make it sound super cool, but it would be very literal and it wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Germans don't call themselves Leute, they call themselves, right? They call themselves the Germans, right? So it's a bit literal. I don't really know why we did this with political correctness. It's kind of like First Nations. Like, well, the First Nations that were here before the white men came. It's like, well, why don't we just call them something that kind of is something of them? It's like, well, we can't do that. It's like, well, I don't really understand how First Nations represents me as a term, but okay, whatever. So Gigi Simon is not a full-blood Inuk. Her father was a European, or of European descent, and worked for the HBC up on top of Quebec there. That's an important thing to kind of point out. Maybe I could point that out in a moment when I get a chance here to stream some of the tabs I have open, but she's from the top of Quebec. So we all know the rest of Quebec, the St. Lawrence Seaway. She's from the top of Quebec, that part that dips down like that near the Davis Strait. That's where she's from. And she attended not a residential school, but a day school. Okay. Which was the same kind of system as a residential school, but obviously you went to residential school if your family lived too far away to send you to day school. This was a day school. And eventually went on to work for the CBC, like everybody else who's ever been an elite, before becoming an advocate for, the Inuit and Northern issues. So she was there. She's been there for a few things. I was looking all this stuff up. Most of this, I have to give credit where credit's due. I think I got most of this stuff from a CTV article. So thank you, Global CTV or whatever it is. Whoever owns you now, one of the big three telecom companies in Canada, or is there just two left? Again, no idea. But whoever owns you, good for you guys. Took most of this from your article. Thank you for doing the research for me. I didn't really know what to do. Anyways, she was there at the repatriation of the Constitution. That's interesting. She's old enough to have remembered that and been a part of it. And the creation of Nunavut as a separate territory. She also served as Canada's ambassador to Denmark. That's common knowledge. And that's important because we have to remember that Denmark, of course, has rights over Greenland. And so between Greenland and the Canadian archipelago are, and then some of the stuff up in Norway there, what are those? Svalbard, something like that. Those island chains all have a ton of polar bears on them, and it's really important for all the environmental circumpolar stuff. All those countries have a stake in the question of the circumpolar question, and so she was Canada's ambassador to Denmark. And then finally, let's take a look here. After being the head of the largest Inuit organization in Canada, she has become our Governor General. So I will admit I have cautious hopes for this new Governor General. Certainly, she is far better adjusted to the role than our previous occupier. I can't say enough bad things about Julie Payette. If you're watching this, Julie, like seriously, leave this country and never speak to any of us again. You are a waste of... I guess I have to not condemn your very soul. That's up to God himself at the end of your life. But like seriously, like please stop taking up the oxygen, at least in this country. Go take up oxygen somewhere else. Like, you are a waste of space. You were a terrible governor general. You completely failed in your role. You were off in your little tryst with your little friend there, not being a great representative of your community, by the way, because we all know that's exactly what was happening. There was the tryst going on and you not doing your job while abusing your staff. That became public knowledge. So I'm not saying anything out of school here. Yeah, get out is basically my point. Get out. And take a train of, the other liberal elites with you that nobody wants in this country anymore either. So just, I don't know if Martin's doing good things anymore. If Martin's still doing good things, he was working really hard for us Indians for a while. I don't know if it's going well or not, but leave him around, I guess. But you can take Kretchen with you and anybody else that's kind of become a problem for us. And just leave. That'd be great. So anyways, I'm glad Payette's out. And we need to be clear here that Mary Simon is certainly far better adjusted for this. Her color and her candor are going to be a welcome in renovation. That is clearly the point. There's a reason they picked a woman of color for this role. There's a reason that this appointment is happening today, yesterday, this time period right now. That's obvious. And the one question, though, of course, is, will her political goals make or break her? Because she has had to oppose the government before. So can she give a voice to the North, which has been almost entirely ignored by this current Trudeau government, and indeed by all Trudeau governments, both senior and junior, by all governments, basically since Diefenbaker, except for a little brief stint with Harper. And can she help her people group? That's a good question. Only time will tell. But at least we have gone back to just wanted them out of the country, but I must admit that Kretchen and Martin's versions of GGs, which were more competent than the Trudeau version of a GG, we wish you all the very best, Mary Simon. May you reign over us in our Queen's stead in a way that First Nations people ought to have always had their peerages. That damn nickel resolution didn't help anybody. Use your position for good. Help Canada to heal from its wounds and move towards the future. I think that about sums it up as a starting place. I really don't think that Julie Payette was a good choice. I know that people had problems with her, like the moment that she was being touted as a possible choice, and I don't have enough bad things to say about her. She was an air cadet. Not just kidding, of course not. And I'm not going to denigrate the air cadets, to be clear. But I guess that's just it. We should have said it literally. She was a space cadet. She was an astronaut. And whoop-de-doo for being an astronaut. Like, good for you. Like, that's great that you were an astronaut. But apparently you couldn't keep your feet on the ground and do a very basic job, which is literally you greet people, do your declensions, like, oh, hello, like, yes, you're going to be an ambassador to Canada. That's great. Here, let me shake your hand and take a picture with you. That'll be another, $300,000 in my bank account this year. Thank you. Like, it's not a hard job. It's not. And she couldn't do it. She couldn't even not abuse her staff. No, I have nothing nice to say about Julie Payette, and may God have mercy on her soul. That's all I have to say. So moving right along, I'm looking forward to our new Governor General here. We'll get John on in just a moment here, but I'm gonna just take a quick look here with one of these things that we're streaming here. Let's see. Use my share screen. Oh, the Albertan has some things to say about our monarch across the sea. I swear no oath to an inbred monarch across the sea. How inbred Queen Lizzie II is, I don't know. I'd have to look that up. I mean, actually, the royal family of England has, ironically, has a lot of different occupiers, so it's not nearly as inbred as some of the others were. So I'm gonna have to correct you on that part, the Albertan, but. I'm a monarchist. I like the monarchy. I think the monarchy is still probably our best bet. I don't know what else we would do. I mean, we could try to do the Republican thing that's happening to the south of us, but voting for your king doesn't seem to go any better. So we need to really think that through before we leave the monarchy. I'm a good Berkey in that way, but I'm also a Tory Catholic, which means that I keep having to fight on behalf of a Protestant usurper, which isn't great, but what are you going to have to do? I'm sure John will have something to say about that later. Anyways, okay, so a lot of this that I took from my opening statement was here in this, what is this? Is this CTV? Yes. And I'm just going to scroll down to some of her early life abilities here. So she was born in, and I'm just going to scroll down to some of her early life abilities. So she was born in, I don't even want to try and pronounce that, but let's give it a go. Born in Kangiskulijak. I'll say that's how it is. An Inuit village in the Nunavik region of northern Quebec. Simon attended a federal day school until she was in grade 6 with a lived what she describes as a very traditional lifestyle. And she does kind of go on to explain a little bit what that would have looked like. And I'm hopeful that this isn't being hammed up. Okay, so one of the problems with our elites these days is they try to tell us about the calluses on their hands that they don't have. I think Mary Simon is being authentic here, but this is like whether we're talking about Joe Biden or we're talking about, you know, Trudeau talking about his struggles living in 24 Sussex as a young boy, like how difficult it was to be him, how difficult it is to be any of the people who lead us. They're talking about calluses they don't have. I'm hopeful that Mary is telling us the full truth here because, yeah, going on to say, you know, many months a year we camped and lived on the land, hunted and fished and gathered food, maintained an active connection with the Inuit heritage. Maybe that part was written by you know, the staffers, but definitely the hunted, fished, and gathered food thing. If that's true, I mean, and it doesn't have to be literally true to the point of they would have starved if they didn't catch a seal that day. That's not what I'm saying. But it's important for us to understand that in the North, given that she is actually from the North, this is a reality that is a little bit closer to the chest. So while I was up north, very briefly in Churchill, I met Inuk guys. I met Inuit people who actually preferred to still call themselves Eskimos, just like how I prefer the term Indian, because that's what's still on my card, for the love of God. When they change what's on my card, I'll stop saying that word. But the point is that those guys up north, they would literally get in a boat. They'd get in a boat, and I mean a boat. I'm not talking about an ocean liner. I'm talking about an aluminum bottom boat, or even like the fiberglass stuff every now and again. But they get into big steel boats that are, you know, 15, 20 feet long at most, with an outboard. Some of them were inboard, but lots of them are outboard, and they would go all the way from Rankin Inlet down to Churchill. So they'd be riding the Hudson's Bay, which has tides of no less than 5 meters in some places. Which is to say well over 15 feet. So these guys were wild. They were wild. Like, that is life in the North. Like, you might, and there are people who have dog sledded all the way from Churchill up to, you know, the next community. I'm not quite sure if they went all the way to Rankin, but they went, you know, quite a ways up into none of it. And like, that still goes on up there. So what I will say is this: if Mary Simon is telling us the truth about the way she was raised, she is a tough lady and she has seen some tough stuff. So I'm hopeful that having that kind of toughness, which seems to be missing from basically everybody who's in charge of Canada right now, even our current federal leader, who, you know, ex-military guy, whatever else, but he's not coming across as very tough, strong. We can get this done. We can rebuild this country. We can do what needs to happen to get Canada back on track. That tough rhetoric just doesn't seem to be anywhere in our country right now. And there's a real lack of leadership, a real lack of heroism, courage, ardor, strength. And hopefully Mary Simon can kind of display that a bit, certainly from a feminine side, but nonetheless, so she can kind of stand up and be like, well, as a woman who was raised in the North, where I literally had to, you know, run a dog team, or literally had to, you know, pull the blubber off of seals by hand, or, you know, it all that sort of thing. I got to eat beluga while I was up there. That was made by an Inuk guy. It was really good. It's pickled. Tastes pretty good. But the point I'm trying to drive home here is that if she's a real Northerner in that sense, then we have some hope when it comes to our new Governor General. So I'm gonna punt that from the stream. We're a little bit early here, but I think John's waiting in the wings here. Let me just bring him on as soon as I can. And John, welcome. Good to see you.
Likewise. And now I can't hear you.
Absolutely. How are things out there? You can't hear me?
No, I can now. Can
you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Hello. Technical issues.
Is that better? John?
I hear you.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's get started right away. What do you think about our new Governor General and what she kind of represents as a opening bid, I think, for the Trudeau re-election campaign?
Well, yes. I mean, it's lens to look at it because Trudeau seems to be reaching. On the other hand, so it looks like she's an excellent choice, and everything you were saying about her is something I accord with. We have had an Aboriginal lieutenant governor before in Ontario. We had James Bartleman, who held the post down extremely well. But again, an Inuit from the high Arctic, it's about time. And
I completely agree.
Yeah, and it sounds like she does have the, so to speak, the royal jelly, as it were. She can do the job. So,
and doing the job, it's I think that one of the things that was really missing with our last Governor General is that I think she thought it was all about her and not about the role that she was playing. And that was the problem. I think Mary Simon is very aware that she's in a role, and then in that role, she gets to be herself if she does the job. But that's where it has to start. She has to play the role.
The Governor General is a vice regal. They're standing in for the monarch. I mean, and there's a lot of ceremony. But at the same time, you have to have the touch for the ceremony. You are, it's pointed out, to receiving the credentials of ambassadors. You are handing out decorations, orders of Canada, orders of military merit, the medals on the people. You are listening. You are also reading legislation. Normally, a good prime minister is listening to your input, although I don't think the current one would listen to anybody. There are a lot of very, very subtle and important roles that the Governor General plays, and most people, especially I think you had that call from someone who was making his remarks about the monarchy. They don't understand what that role entails and what it means, and they are vitally important for us.
And it's not just vitally important in a purely symbolic sense. The fact of the matter is that if even from a pragmatic sense, like, you have somebody who is in the role because they have a competency to it, and they're raised to be in it when it comes to the monarch themselves. And if it's not the monarch, if it's a vice regal representative, we're taking them from the echelon that we believe has been properly formed to help make these decisions on behalf of all the people in a non-partisan way. Now, let's be clear, when it comes to the vice regal representatives of certain appointments, or rather of certain governments, I mean, that was, I think, the other problem that was big with Julie Payette. The Trudeau government really did try to, it tried to combine all the elixirs of Pearson, Trudeau Senior, and King, and go, you know what we'll do? We'll really just remake Canada in our image, and we can totally partisanize this vice regal representative and that'll be fine. We'll just run Canada like it's our backyard. And I think that's what blew up in their face. Payette was clearly not just a liberal elite in the way that we know that they all are from the Laurentian Valley, but she really came across as someone who was anti-religion, anti anybody in Canada who wasn't just, a stone's throw away from where she was living at. And she really did abuse her staff and abuse anybody that got in her way. And she didn't think of herself as needing to represent all Canadians.
Well, if you look at the long list of very successful governors general and lieutenants governor that we've had, one of the first things you're really looking for is dignity. Someone who can hold the office down, and then someone who's easy to respect. And you think back of, again, some of the more successful governors general, some of the successful lieutenant governors, they were people that were very easy to respect. But they also had, just like the royal family does, they could go into a crowd and talk to anybody And if you've ever met a member of the royal family, especially the Queen, but I've noticed it with others, they come out, a politician wades into a crowd, and the politician is normally trying to convince you that he's important. Where, a royal or a vice regal walks into a crowd and they come out leaving you feel that you're important. That's a very critical distinction.
It really is. And what does seem to be interesting when it comes to the question of monarchy versus an elected representative is that in the end, the monarchy is a family. It's a family. And so our representation of the ideal of the state is not an elected person. There actually have been bachelors who have been elected president of the United States. We forget about that. There were a couple of them. And the same thing when it comes to even prime ministers of Canada. I believe that King was a bachelor and so was Bennett.
Sure.
And we've had these different representations over time, but always in the highest office, unless of course you're George III with no legitimate heirs or whatever. The idea is that the monarchy is always a familial representation. This is the ideal of the state. The state is contained within the family, within the sovereign. And I think that's something that we need to keep kind of close to our hearts, especially as we think about maybe renovating our constitution or changing whether or not we have a monarchy. Do you want just one more partisan, hackish person at the helm of government? Or do you want someone who, quite frankly, was basically raised to be in charge, or at least understands that they're acting out a role? It's not about them. They're simply putting on the robes, putting on the crown, and acting out a role on behalf of everyone.
That's a second. I just got to kill this damn thing.
That's not a problem.
Sorry about that.
No.
I guess the point for the monarchy, and I've actually found myself defending the monarchy quite often, and I have very strong feelings about it. But there are three things to remember. One, parliamentary. Some people just don't get it. The first thing about a parliamentary monarchy is that you have somebody who is holding all the executive power with the understanding that they never exercise it. So, if you imagine someone like Pierre Trudeau, say Sir Justin Trudeau, if he'd been elected as president of the United States, it would have been a huge ego boost. And he would be running in there trying to claim all sorts of power they're not entitled to have. What you have with a parliamentary monarchy is that speed bump. You've won the election, you've got the tremendous ego boost. Now you are asking for permission to form a government for the monarch. It's a tremendous safeguard. It's very subtle, and most people don't get it, but it really is a protection. And if you look, there's a collection of political economists, including the Fraser Institute, but the Cato Institute in the States, an Austrian outfit. They do an annual report on. Sorry, I'm. Damn, that is very annoying. They do an annual report on basically individual freedoms and human rights, and the highest standards consistently in the top 10 are crowded up with parliamentary monarchies. They have the best record when it comes to protecting individual rights. And you can't argue with that. They also have very high standards of political stability. When was the last civil war that the British had? 1689. And then say, look at a country like France, where in Britain you've got one continuous government going on since 1689. In France, you've got 3 republics, 3 empires, 3 foreign military occupations, and 5 republics. It's just constant. The other point, of course, is for Canadians, it's important. We should be a republic. We're a big, mature country. What? We want to be the third republic on this continent and the smallest one. We want to lose all of the distinctiveness in our institutions and in our customs that make us different from the United States and from Mexico, and lose that much of our history? Thank you. No, you know nothing about Canadian history. Even expressing that opinion means you need to go back to school.
Yeah, I understand.
Now it's that, and of course, I don't know about you, but I've often enjoyed myself in the United States by sort of engaging in linguistic culture shock. You know, they talk about state land. I talk about crown land. They talk about judges. I talk about the Queen's Bench. You know, they talk about particular regiments, or the United States Navy, and I say the Royal Canadian Navy or the Royal Canadian Air Force, or the regiment I served in, the Queen's York Rangers, which fought on the Crown side in the American Revolution and came to Canada as part of the Loyalist epic. So, I mean, again, the Crown is woven deep into Canada's soul, and only an idiot would want to pull it out because they think we're supposed to be mature.
There's only a few kind of things like that really drive that home for some people. One of them is speaking of regiments, when you look at how many regiments in the United States are basically based in numbers. They have numbers to try and delineate where they are or who they are. And in Canada, so much of them are locally based, or they're person based. They have a name to them, or they have a locality to them that tells us who they are and what they are. I've always found that to be quite beautiful, actually, that difference of the way we name things in Canada.
Yeah, and it often means that a unit is a lot more solidly rooted in the community. And again, American formations, they come and they go. The 15th Tank Regiment served with distinction, in Korea, and it isn't listed anymore. It's gone. But the Lord Strathcona's, they've got a history that is epic. And around 120 years now. So.
Absolutely. I guess maybe a way to kind of pivot here is to say, well, if people are ignorant of Canadian history when it comes to the monarchy, how ignorant are people when it comes to these statues that are being removed and vandalized, and of course the churches that are being scourged around and scorched for that matter around Canada? It seems to be a kind of direct connection there that something's gone kind of terribly wrong when it comes to historical understanding of Canada. It's being transformed, it's being warped. Some people are making hay out of it and getting ahead of the curve, and some people are getting left behind and seeing their monuments or their sacred spaces harmed.
It's this historic phenomenon. Iconoclasm. In the Byzantine Empire, you look at various other points. The Puritans in England walked into all these old medieval churches and wrecked them. Centuries of art and history were lost. And again, it's the spur of the moment. And you look at the sort of people who are out there tearing down statues and thinking they're doing something. Again, they are normally entirely ignorant of history, and they're stealing from the heritage that belongs to all of us. We'll have to put those statues back up again. And one hopes that there is a natural justice, that these people turn up again in orange jumpsuits under supervision, and start scrubbing the statue and manually putting it back up again. But that's our history, and like it or leave it, it's all part of it. And again, one thing that really annoys me right now, for example, in Toronto, Mayor John Tory, who all I can say in his favor is that he wears suits very well, but that's it. But 16,000 people apparently signed a petition that they're going to change some names. The name of Yonge Street, the longest street in the world, and Dundas Street, because apparently these people were involved in slavery or something over 200 years ago. And I'm sorry, Dundas was a friend of the first Lieutenant Governor of the province, John Graves Simcoe, who was the colonel of the Queen's Rangers during the American Revolutionary War, came back to Canada in 1792 as the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, picked up, those who wanted to come from his old regiment who were in New Brunswick and brought them in and built Toronto. most of the streets in the downtown core are named for members of the regiment. And of course, the two big streets, Yonge Street and Dundas. Well, Dundas was a personal friend, but not only that, he was in the British cabinet because he won a key abolitionist legal battle, freeing a black slave in Scotland and establishing the principle that slavery was no longer allowed in Scotland. Yeah. Because, he was a British cabinet minister, 200 years ago, you want to change his name and go through all the expense, and you know nothing about him. Or the other point, of course, is that John Graves Simcoe, the first lieutenant governor of the province, two of his former officers, Aeneas Shaw and Sam Jarvis, came with him, and you've got Shaw Street and Jarvis Street, as well as Simcoe Street in downtown Toronto. And they were former slave owners before the American Revolution in the American South. But they were the men that Simcoe talked to. He said, I don't want to have slavery up in Upper Canada. What's the best way of accomplishing this? And these two were said, well, boss, it works like this. And, Ontario became, the first entity in the British Empire where slavery was no longer possible, where it was banned. But again, nobody, the current, person who wants to throw paint on a statue and then tear it down doesn't bother to do any research.
No, I think their library cards expired along with most of their ID. But I think that something else that's kind of key here is that even John A. Macdonald, he was such a laughable character. I miss kind of, in a sense, the old Liberal Party. I miss the Liberal Party of the 90s that was just trying to undermine any good ideas conservatives ever had by just making fun of conservatives. So Diefenbaker was a bit of a weirdo in every textbook I read, and I remember the same thing happened with John A. Macdonald. He was a drunk. Borden was just a bit of a stiffler, a bit of a he was a stickler for rules and whatever, and Bennett was just a rich jerk. Like there were these caricatures of them, and that was the way that history was taught. Now we're taught that they might have all as well been crypto Nazis, despite living before Nazism or during Nazism and hating it, or after it had been discarded. And their grave sites or former sites of glory are being desecrated. And the latest happened in Kingston. I'm sure you heard about it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you walk around downtown Kingston, or you did 5-10 years ago, Sir John A. Macdonald was everywhere. He was one of the most famous sons of that particular city, and you could see his statue, see the places where he was, and have lunch in a restaurant that was in his former law office. He was part and parcel of it. The other thing is that, again, I'm sorry, people who tear down statues are simpletons. And the actual facts of the matter is that history is always far more complex than you know. And again, Macdonald was, he was our first prime minister, but he was also trying to handle things. I mean, and remember the Indian Act, although that came out under the Liberals, but the whole object of it was to try and get the Indians to survive. And a lot of people forget what things were like. We raised the Northwest Mounted Police to protect the Plains Indians from American whiskey traders who were killing them. And again, there was the massacre that was the final straw, and basically drove the Mounties out to the prairies. I think the other point is that, when you talk about the hunger that drove a lot of the Indians into the reservations, most people, again, have never, ever thought about the history that drove it. But the winter of 1883-84 is also referred to in some of the Indian records from Canada and the United States as the Hunger Winter. And if you look at some of the newspapers from that winter or from that spring, when the snow finally melted in early 1884, there were corpses coming out of snowbanks from Winnipeg to Texas. It was a horrible winter. It killed off a lot of independent farmers, independent ranchers. It also meant that every Indian that was not on a reservation was starving because there was no hunting possible. Of course, if you try and draw the connections, it might be that, remember the explosion of Mount Krakatoa in 1883?
Mm-hmm.
And well, that winter was probably one of the most hideous winters known in North American weather records ever. We're looking at like 20 to 30 feet of snow, across most of North America. And that's what caused it. But, again, people think, well, no, it's all the buffalo were shot. Well, actually, on the Great Plains, what was left of the buffalo was left of most of the cattle. They died buried in snowdrifts that winter. In the spring, there was nothing. And again, that was suddenly you've got the federal government going, okay, we've got all these Indians coming out to all the different reservations, and they're all demanding food. And Ottawa at that time was small, parsimonious, narrowly governed. But suddenly, the demand for rations was incredible, and we still hadn't got the railroad built. Again, logistics. How did they get food out to these reserves in the far west?
And it's funny because my band actually does get its name from the massacre you named. Of course, the massacre at Cypress Hills. Carry the Kettle is my band's name, and that has to do with going back for the kettle during the firefight with the whiskey traders. And I mean, to your point of Indians making demands upon reservations, people throughout the West, First Nations throughout the West, coming to ask the government for help in this moment of crisis. Again, we look throughout the Indian Act. The Indian Act has all these rules around giving out shot and giving out the means for sustenance and self-sustaining and rights around fishing, around hunting. Like, people think that it's just a laundry list of racism. It's like, no, it's a laundry list from a different era around these very issues, which are not issues anymore because you can go to McDonald's at 2 a.m. and that didn't exist back then.
Well, there's also more to it than that. I mean, let's face it. There's a lot that went wrong. But again, when the Indian Act was drawn up, I mean, the academic discipline of anthropology didn't exist yet. We didn't know how to study a culture and identify its good points and support it. It just wasn't there. There are other things as well. So, I mean, there was sort of a Victorian ignorance behind the Indian Act. They meant well. Among other things, the whole object was to make sure that the First Nations survived. But yeah, it was a Victorian way of thinking that the way they do it is they all learn English and become farmers. And we know, because now that was, in some respects, you can call it cultural genocide, but cultural genocide as a term did not exist in the 1880s. It was not understood.
No, it wasn't understood at all. I think that as we kind of look at the wider world then and kind of try and take up a bit of an international scope here, it seems like parts are moving very fast. So for Canada, I mean, up until about 15 minutes ago, I don't know how things are going over there in Alberta, but here in BC, we might as well have, Iwo Jima's secure as far as we're concerned over here in BC. The pandemic is over. People, I don't know, I didn't really get the memo that the pandemic was hemming or hawing or waxing or waning, but it's over. Like, July 1 came and went. Bonnie Henry put herself at the front of the parade and said, yep, don't worry, I'm giving you all permission to do all the things you're already doing. And nobody's wearing masks anymore, and everything's basically over, except for kind of some staff in some places at some stores. So that's over. But now we're immediately pivoting into the wildfires, and of course some of the church fire stuff, but also the wildfires and then climate change. And it's like rhetoric hasn't changed. The same fevered pitch is there. They're just singing a different tune. Now it's climate change and what's going on around the world there. At an international level, are you kind of seeing this same pivot? People are no longer talking about the pandemic so much, and they're immediately heading into the question of climate change?
Well, actually, in some respects, I wish they were thinking about climate change, and they aren't. Instead, it's the usual things that have come up and still came up. Well, COVID, we were still dealing with COVID. And we might see another wave of COVID come as some of the South Asian strains come creeping out and being appeared. We might be in masks again, but Internationally, it's almost like the same old, same old. Again, the Palestinians and they're eternalists towards the Israelis. Iran acting up, China pushing and pushing and pushing, and it's like pushing, at Taiwan. It's pushing at its other neighbors, and the Russia is bullying the Ukraine again. In fact, actually, one of the things that most people missed was that the Russians provided another example of what we call gray zone warfare, where somebody blew a drone with a thermite grenade into the Ukraine's largest ammunition inventory and blew it up. Just thousands of tons of ammunition cooked off, and it seems to have been done by a teenager with a drone, and accidentally and not on purpose. Very, very strange.
Very
and
strange.
Of course, the British are still trying to get have their EU cake and leave the table at the same time, and the EU is still trying to figure out what to do with the British and Brexit. Mm-hmm. And so, global warming doesn't seem to occur. The end of the epidemic doesn't really seem to be registering. Yet these are real problems.
No, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. Well, let's start from we haven't talked about Ukraine in a long time. Let's start there. What I'm remembering, it feels like it was so long ago, but honestly, the Ukrainian war, Cold War, the Crimea conflict, whatever you want to call it, it's not really that long ago. I feel like the number 2014 comes to mind. Am I right on that? 2014?
Yeah, that's when the Crimea was grabbed. And again, you're asking, I think, especially for angry calls from listeners, depending on their own national backgrounds. But Ukraine has been trying to come out of Russia's shadow ever since, and Russia's been trying to drag it back in. It's like Russians feel an emotional need that the Ukraine is part of Russia, where Ukrainians want to be very much out of Russia's shadow. And of course, you had at the very end of the Soviet era, the new boundaries of Ukraine that were drafted by Russians primarily to keep the Ukraine tucked into the Soviet Union. So you've got the eastern Ukraine, that's sort of more ethnic Russian than Ukrainian, and the Crimea, which is it was actually neither Russian nor Ukrainian until very, very recently. But also you have this sort of strange, again, gray zone conflict. For example, in Kiev, you suddenly had a power blockage. The power system got hacked. So the capital of the Ukraine was entirely blacked out, accidentally and not on purpose at the very same time. Unknown mercenaries and paramilitaries were taking over the Crimea. And of course, Moscow's claiming, it wasn't us, it was these groups. We don't know where they come from. It was just like the group of Cossacks who shot down the Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine. They weren't actually Russian military. So, all right, so it was a Cossack band, but what the heck were they doing with surface-to-air missiles that can shoot down an international airliner 30,000 feet up? That's military equipment. That doesn't belong to a paramilitary. And you have this on again and off again border war all along the new frontier, where the Russians just keep pushing. And again, it's not the Russian military. It's just paramilitary forces that happen to have multiple rocket launchers, modern tanks, are fully stocked with small arms and lots of ammunition. And God knows how they got it. And Moscow's acting innocent.
Maybe they've kind of taught us exactly how warfare goes nowadays. You have to have non-state actors doing the state's work, or else you're actually in a hot war, and hot wars aren't allowed anymore ever since Nagasaki.
Yes. On the other hand, if you go all the way back to 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia, we came out of Europe came out of the 30 Years' War, but before that, they came out of centuries of warfare by private actors. Cities would declare war on each other. The bishop might be fighting with a mercenary company. A merchants league had its own warships out at sea. And then suddenly it was, the European countries go, we're tired of this. War is official now. You've got everyone in a uniform with a commission from their national government, national flags. Warfare is for states, not for all these private actors. But ever since 1990, the world is being made safer again. How many times have you actually seen nation states in the last 30 years fight each other?
I guess Iraq.
Yeah, basically. You can probably count all the nation state wars that were fought according to the old ways, by national militaries answering to national governments on both sides, on one hand with a finger or two left over. Instead, what we have is a new world now where, mercenaries, paramilitaries, corporations, religious sects, tribes are conducting war, usually paying for it through organized crime, narcotics and people smuggling especially. But the other point is that the resources are becoming more and more available to them. And most people don't really understand this. But remember, for example, a couple of years ago, Jamaica was trying to stop gang wars in the slums of Kingston, Jamaica, and they sent in their army, which got beaten. The drug gangs chased the army out of their own capital. Pakistan can't control what happens in its major cities anymore. Same thing in Nigeria. You've got these permanent hot zones that even the national government can't interfere in anymore. The same time, we also have a growing number of people, as we've seen, like the Russians who, somehow or other put thermite grenades on drones and fly them into ammunition dumps. Or the Iranians who are supporting the Houthi militias in Yemen were able to fire Scud missiles at the capital of Saudi Arabia. So the technology that's being provided to these people is growing. And we're getting to a stage now where in a few years, warfare might be like it was 800 years ago, a constant fact of life being waged by private actors with the best technology they can get, going on around our lives continuously.
Which is something that I think it'd be kind of interesting, because that'd be kind of the Middle Easternization of the whole world in that case, because that's kind of been in the reality of the Middle East, I'm sure in other time periods, but as we understand it in the modern time, really from the founding of Israel onwards.
Well, remember that most of the Arab states in the 1950s and 1960s, you had the Nasser model, the sort of socialist, nationalist, militaristic state government. But then after 1979, you suddenly got the Islamic militias creeping out and growing. Now, some states are managing to hold it together, but others are, completely dissolving. The Libya, for example, is, it's no longer really a national state. Or I mentioned Yemen earlier on. I mean, more or less since its independence, whatever passes for the government in Yemen can control what happens within rifle shot of the presidential palace and not much else.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people interested in that territory, and the territory is strategic. So there are hands dipping in there and pushing.
It maybe you can give us a bit of a kind of a survey or a kind of read on history on this question. Then was the state system a luxury? Was it just, it happened to work for a time? It was a very Western concept. It was from a certain time period. It was from the terrors of religious warfare. That's where it originated from, and it was only going to last as long as you could have the meta narratives to hold it together. Now we're losing those meta narratives, these grand national narratives. There's a lot of doubt. Postmodernism has creeped in. Are we not just going back to our natural state then, of there being independent actors who have decided over some bizarre theological point or some, probably not even very valuable piece of land or resource or whatever to pick a fight with one another?
That's possible. The world is going like that, but remember, there are a lot of strong nation states still, and the other point is the will. Is the willpower exist for the nation state to protect its own interests? Um, you still see it in some cases, and a big part of the sort of the tolerance for these transnational groups. How well do you know your Rudyard Kipling? You remember
A
his
little
poem?
bit.
Oh, you remember his poem, The Danegeld?
Mm.
Where he talks about how you sometimes get a modern nation, in this case, England in the 9th and 10th century. Things are much too important. So, whoever you are who are causing trouble and, burning coastal villages and carrying off our citizens, here's some money, go away and stop bothering us. And once you start paying the Danegeld, you're never rid of the Dane. The point is that a nation state either cracks down on this problem harshly, brutally, and completely, or all the structures of the state melt away. Mm-hmm. That's your choice. So you either have order, peace, order, and good government, which is what our country is partly founded on, or you don't. But if you are going to have those things, you better be prepared to enforce them. And in the postmodernist environment, with the military as unfashionable as it is, things are starting to get untenable. There are parts of Canada that are not administered by law and order anymore. And if we're not careful, those areas are going to grow and get worse.
It's interesting too what other state actors will take advantage of, right? And what strong states or states with more control over their rest of populations than we have will do to us in order to kind of get a leg up. So the thing that comes to mind is, of course, China lecturing us about what happened inside of the residential schools and everything else that's been happening lately. As if China has a leg to stand on. They're going to call the residential school system in Canada Auschwitz, while they actually run gulag prison camps that harvest organs. It's obscene, but they're getting away with it, and nobody's calling them back on it. No one's responding or fighting back.
Oh, I don't know about not having a leg to stand on, but the Chinese government does have 60 million corpses to stand on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm sort of thinking, okay, that's a conservative estimate for the number of deaths they've caused. Yes, including, Tibet doesn't exist anymore. The genocide there has been successful. And the genocide of the Uyghurs. But okay, China can lecture us on morality. Mm-hmm. Of course, people had better understand why they are lecturing us on morality. Because China would really like to make deals for Canadian resources with First Nations without having to go through Ottawa or the provincial capitals. So, yes, they probably like every natural resource British Columbia has, if they can deal with somebody so they can extract them without having to put up with trouble from bureaucrats or from Canadian corporations. So, if you go out to some of the reserves, there are always going to be one or two idiots out there who will listen to an overture like that. And those one or two idiots will also get money. They may have a rifle or two in the trunk and some other things. They'll be able to make trouble. And if they intimidate the reserve, they will then start to working on intimidating the rest of us. In the meantime, all those resources will be shipped off.
Maybe part of the problem is, John, that our conception of the nation state and our conception of really international relations in general is like people are still walking around with like the billiard ball sort of conception of like, well, a nation state's this whole connected thing. It's opaque. Its will is singular and uniform and monolithic, and they bounce off each other on the billiard table, and they can congregate over here, they can congregate over there, you can stand alone over there, and that's how it is. But really, it's like there's billiard tables within billiard tables within billiard tables about how our international relations really work. There are mining interests in Canada and various groups interested in those mining interests that are talking to people overseas instantaneously. They're not even waiting for the for the carrier pigeon to come home. They can talk to them right now on a satellite phone in the middle of nowhere in Canada and say, I've just made a massive discovery. I know I have this fault line. I can see where this gold is going, this graphene is going, whatever. And I need you to get on the phone with someone else over here. And then they're going to talk to our government. And then this is going to happen. And now we can finally start building this mine before the regulatory agency even knows that we've made this discovery. How do we change it? Is that a good thing for international relations? Is it bad? Is it good for the market? Is it bad for the market? What do we do to make our sovereignty more felt without it just turning into another exercise in red tape rigmarole?
Well, I think the big part, and again, this goes back to where we fell down, with the passage of the Indian Act, is we have to exercise our sovereignty, but we have to exercise our sovereignty with intelligence. And that's the big point. And we need to pay attention in Ottawa. We don't need a large civil service with all sorts of progressive ideas. We need a small, well-trained civil service that understands what its function is and exercises it. And here's a story from the past. You remember the Airborne Regiment, the one that Chrétien dismantled?
That's right.
You don't know about some of the episodes of them in the 1960s and 70s, do you?
No, I don't.
Well, up in the high Arctic, we had some very interesting mineral finds, and some multinational companies headquartered in the United States were coming in to exploit them. And of course, in the high Arctic, if you run an airfield, an airstrip, Transport Canada has rules about what you have on an airstrip, because we might need it to conduct a search and rescue operation or to fly relief to somebody. But the company was basically told Ottawa, run along, go away. This is our airfield, and we don't need to put up with any of your stuff. So the Airborne Regiment dropped in for a 3-week exercise on the airfield. It was a demonstration, sort of, this is our territory, our sovereignty, our rules, and our forces. And the company realized, okay, Transport Canada, we will do exactly what you say and do that henceforth. Mm-hmm. That was a more robust era, but it was also a simpler era. And most Canadians have never heard the story because nothing ever came of it, except that the corporation knuckled under.
And we don't. I'm not saying that we don't have any ways of showing strength today, but we certainly, I think in the 60s we still had an aircraft carrier. Today, I think we have a couple of ships in dry dock that still haven't been constructed completely. This is the other half of playing this dangerous game in Canada of undersupplying our armed forces and our Royal Navy, our Royal Air Force. If we don't get a handle on our own defensive situation and are able to exercise sovereignty within our own borders, which is debatable at this point, I think if the Russians wanted to go do the exact same thing to us, have a 3-week exercise with their airborne division somewhere in the high Arctic, I don't know if we would have the means to go and push them off or politely see them back to their boats or their aircraft. I don't know if we'd have the means to do that.
Oh, it gets better than that. I was at a conference in Nova Scotia a few years ago where the Canadian Navy was talking about the new shipping control center it has, so that it knew every vessel that was in Canadian waters coming or going and what was on it. But the friend I was with, he said, you want to see something interesting? And the next day we went up to a small outport in Nova Scotia, further up the coast from Halifax, where a Russian icebreaker was leaving the port with its deck covered with stolen vehicles. They're shipping cars stolen from all sorts of places in Eastern Canada off somewhere in probably the Middle East. And of course, we had no clue that it was there. But you go to that community, and that community was carefully entitled to the attentions of one RCMP officer 1 day a week. So we're really enforcing our laws and protecting our sovereignty there. Mm-hmm. And there are other stories like that all over the place. If you remember Weibo Ludwig, you've got an area the size in terms of population of Prince Edward Island. It's even bigger in terms of territory. and 3 Mounties looking after it. And actually, the reason why Ottawa was starting to pay attention to Webo Ludwig was that Webo's neighbors were starting to talk about, so under the law for self-defense, if I see a certain car digging up a pipeline that I know has got sour gas in there, I'm entitled to protect my family by killing the person in that car. And this is, an Alberta farmer talking to a Mountie. There's problems here. We're not looking after our law and our order and our stability as we should.
And nothing really exemplified that better in the last few weeks than the fact that, if I had told you a few minutes ago that oh yeah, I just saw some more burning churches on TV, be like, where in northern Iraq or in Pakistan or maybe it's Boko Haram is at it again in Nigeria. And you'd ask me where in the developing world did this happen? I said, oh no, it's happening in Canada. They're on church number 5 or 6 now. And they've got many of them vandalized, and this is happening. I mean, you would have been shocked, and I'd be shocked too. What is going on in this country where we're having the same behaviors visited upon us that literally are something we see on, the 6 o'clock news of somewhere in the world that isn't here. That's where that happens. That happens over there. That doesn't happen over here. Well, it's happening down the street now.
Well, I guess the other side of the equation is not just, the hard nuts and bolts of a nation and the sense of a nation that we need to survive. Postmodernism also means you don't teach history anymore, or you teach a very specific version of history. I mean, do people really know about the history of the Catholic Church and, the Indians? But, who was protecting the last of the Hurons? Who was sheltering the Mohawks, the Abenakis? Who was running schools for centuries, in Quebec before the residential schools came up? And again, some of the points about some of the graveyards that are being found now, I mean, there's also Catholic clergy, nursing, sisters, and brothers who are, I think in one residential school cemetery in British Columbia, there's 3 bishops buried in there who died looking after their churches. Or I think another point about one of the epidemics that hit Canada in the 1840s. The typhus. You suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of people dying of typhus. I think it was in Toronto, and almost all the medical staff and everyone else took off. The disease was so frightening, the city was abandoned. There was 2 sets of people who would volunteer to stay behind and look after the sick and to bury them. Catholic clergy and British military medicals. The medical officers from the British Regiment and the Catholic Church were the only ones who stayed behind. We don't teach that history. I guess the other side of it too. I mean, some of the great stories about the First Nations. I mean, Champlain surviving his first winter because the Mi'kmaq were teaching him how to fight scurvy. I always get a Samuel Hearn on Great Slave Lake. I always thought that story probably one of the most noble ones in the whole history of Canada. Who teaches it? How basically his hosts were not going to let him go, continue his explorations in the wilderness in winter, because they would not have it said that they would let a stranger die by himself.
Yeah, I thinking about up north when I was up in Churchill. My employer at the time, he was very into the story of Samuel Hearn, and so he not only was the boat called the Sam Hearn, the big boat that looks like a landing craft ready for D-Day because of the gate on it and everything, but also the learning center that he put together about the northern journey and that sort of thing, and the great overland journey through the north. At that time, Rupert's Land and Northwest Territories, eventually now none of it, and of course the Northwest Territories. These are beautiful stories about Canada, but where where do they get taught? I mean, who's still reading Robert Service? I mean, I think Robert Service did a better job of explaining what Canada was really about, and he wasn't even born here. But there seems to have been, so it's like that original. I think Mark Stein said it once of what kind of happened in the post-war era, the very end of the post-war era, kind of the last Edwardians, I guess, was right before the coronation of Elizabeth, or right at that time, Elizabeth II, that Everest is summited, and there's the 4-minute mile and all these great heroes, and the same thing kind of happened in Canada for its first 60, 70 years of existence, and things seem to have kind of decamped from there. What happened to our sense of history? What happened to our sense of self?
I guess there's three things that happened to our sense of history. One, we're too close to the United States and the American media. And so we keep hearing their stories and not our own. And then, of course, the second point is that, that there is this Canadian reticence, that we don't talk about heroes much. And that's always been our problem, that we're proud of the fact that we're not chest thumpers, although we should do some chest thumping. And then, of course, even before we could actually really get going, I mean, Pierre Burton was just starting to write his stories about, details of Canadian history, but the first postmodernists were coming out of our schools. So again, that story is just not remembered. Mm-hmm. But heck, the greatest triumph of the CBC in filmmaking was the Canadian Railroad series. When have they ever shown it since? It came out in the 1980s.
I got to see that when I was a kid in school. Our socials teacher had a copy of it, or he had recorded it himself. And so, of course, I still belong to the generation of kids that before smart screens and before tablets in the classroom. So the big TV on the trolley gets pushed in, and we're great. It's movie day. Well, it turned out to be movie week because we were watching this for every period of the week. Probably almost 2 weeks of this Canadian Railroad thing, right? We're watching this thing, and it was amazing because it wasn't just like, why haven't they shown it again? It's this beautiful work of art for the time, because it was so campy with the reenactments and everything else. The two things that I will never forget are, I guess there's three. There was Pierre Burton beginning the introduction to it all when he literally said, children were conceived to the sounds of the CPR going by. That I remember. I will never forget that. The second one was that, of course, the crazy American surveyor who got them through the Rockies. Can't remember his name, but that guy. And he wanted his check on the wall. He was paid, I don't know, $1 million or something. Back in the day, and so he cashed his check, but he wanted to keep the original, and they made some adjustments to it to show it couldn't be cashed again, but he did keep his original on the wall. And then there was the moment where they're dealing with the tunnels that are being built through the Fraser Canyon, and of course a blast goes off too soon, and unfortunately a worker from Asia is killed. But the body is hung up on the edge of the Fraser, and it results in literally a guy in buckskin, who kind of looks like me, I guess, without the beard, but isn't wearing the right costume for that area. He looks like he's from a plains area. He's not from the coast, but that doesn't matter. The point being that he all of a sudden pulls out a gunny stack, some dynamite, and a rope, and proceeds to lower it down upon the precipice where the body is, and essentially send that body to where it belongs, which is the river. It's just this moment of I remember watching this in school and being like, this is insane. I can't believe they ever made this. And it's well, I mean, it was a different time, but I mean, it's still a better story than most of the postmodern stuff that we're coming out with today.
Yeah. And again, it's part of our national heritage and our myth, and, good, bad, and ugly. There's a lot in there that we should be familiar with. Or, I mean, Canadian military history is well covered if you're interested in it, but I mean, that's an option. again, the saga of what we were doing in the First World War. Most Canadians don't have any idea. And of course, there's all sorts of other things. And the heritage moments had their moments. And some of those stories are fine stories, but there's a lot of details that still have to be covered. There's a thousand episodes that should be part of our national mythology and our that show where we can come together. I mean, for example, the first synagogue in North America was actually in Halifax. Nobody knows that, not anymore. Or Europeans used to come like to Winnipeg in the 1880s and marvel that here was this cosmopolitan society of people from all over the planet in Canada. Same thing, being noticed in Hamilton or Montreal. We think this sort of multiculturalism from Trudeau. Well, no, we've always been a group of different people. And the wrong word in 1972 was chosen because we're not multicultural, we're cosmopolitan. And there's some very sort of profound differences. But we've never really understood or honored that, except as some sort of modern phenomenon, rather than one that goes back a long way. And again, there are aspects of living here. I mean, Canada, settlement in Canada was not led by Cossacks or cavalry. It was led by sales clerks. And that was only possible because the First Nations were different. This was not a country where somebody had to fight tooth and nail across every foot of territory. I mean, think about the number of, if I can use the word, Indian wars against settlement that were actually fought in Canada, because you can count them on one hand. In most part, it was cooperative. Why? Because there's some aspect of our culture and our geography that means you don't make a fuss about strangers because you might need them. And that's a central part of our core, and we forget that. We don't really understand it because we've never thought about it.
I recall that was another person that was facing cancellation and denigration. It was General Amherst, who, of course, was a logistical genius. His strategy with the blankets is still up for debate, but I've heard it said, at least from the historian whose house I occupy when I do this show, that of course it was offenders in some of the First Nation raiders that had been spreading smallpox around by grabbing scalps off of bodies, that had happened as well, and that's not talked about either when it comes to biological warfare.
I'm not sure about scalps, but smallpox can hide in cloth for a very, very long time. So Amherst, I don't think actually needed to hand out blankets to the First Nations. I think a First Nations one of Pontiac's people, took a family in the Ohio Valley and then ran off with their blankets. And 2 weeks later was wondering why smallpox is spreading all through his home village and going on from there.
No, it makes sense. Makes sense. Let's take our turn into the international scope here again. So we have this new Governor General. She was the ambassador to Denmark. Denmark obviously is a big player in the circumpolar world and the things that happen there. Maybe you could explain to our listeners and viewers a little bit about how did China get involved with the circumpolar thing? They seem to be everywhere, even though the fact that they don't touch anything that is in Arctic water by any stretch of the imagination. What's happening when it comes to the circumpolar question? Are countries going to cooperate around it, or are we eventually going to see our own little battles up there as we try to extract resources?
Well, remember, the whole point about the circumpolar conference when it first began for two reasons. One is standardized search and rescue. Because remember, this was the Soviets, not the Russians at the time, but a plane goes missing somewhere off Siberia or somewhere off of Greenland, and you want whoever hears the SOS to be able to come to answer. The other side of things was the ecology. Again, in the 1970s, we started to notice the number of polar bears was dropping off, and that it didn't take much, to get rid of a huge number of critical animals like muskox. And then, of course, from there in, everything else followed naturally. So it was important. But yeah, the potential resources under the Arctic ice to agree on it, if you're actually going to go after them, because no one's actually got that problem. Well, the Chinese are there because they want those resources. They've got no actual Arctic presence. There's nothing there. Everybody else who's in the Circumpolar Conference has got territory above the Arctic Circle, except for China. So it's sort of, it's a poker table, and a stranger is trying to deal himself in.
Well, I think he'll get away with it, to be honest with you. I think President Xi and the gang have gotten away with pretty much everything they've done so far. So I don't really predict a lot of resistance to him, even by the other nations. And of course, there's somewhat a friend in Russia. And that's probably all they need.
Well, let's face it. I mean, China is actually going to have a tremendously, a really profound impact in the Arctic Circle. Because in 20 or 30 years, that might be the only inhabitable area left on the planet. Mm-hmm. And that is, China is the one country with 1,500 coal power generating plants, which is also contributing to the acidification of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, they are the worst ecological offenders on the planet, bar none, and are probably contributing the most to climate change, and are getting a free ride on it.
Well, that's
the only way I could think of is them really having an impact in the Arctic.
Well, they'll have to go and build their own greater coast prosperity sphere than move off into Russia and take Siberia. But I think that when it comes to the question of the circumpolar thing, I think that when it comes to the question of the circumpolar thing, it's a very interesting place. It is still rather pristine for the most part, and the concerns there are this weird blend between international issues, of course, as you mentioned, the ecology of the place, and then therefore the tourism ecology that can happen, right? The ecotourism, and then finally, the issue of what kind of economic resources can be got out of the Arctic. Is Canada ever going to take the Arctic seriously, or are we going to be one step behind everybody else in this one too?
Well, we have the same problem with the Arctic that every other member of the Circumpolar Conference has, including the Russians. Distance, logistics. It's hard to get up there. It's a long way from anything, and there's not many people out there. There's not much of a labor force you can prey on. So yes, the Americans might be able to pull some oil off of the North Slope of Alaska, because they've got the resources and the money and the people in Alaska. Everywhere else, I mean, if we have oil on Ellesmere Island, it'll stay there, for 100 years. We might not need oil anymore. There's no way of pulling it down. And again, ocean resources. How do you drill for oil when you've got ice back? How do you mine for manganese on the floor of the floor of the ocean? When you have to deal with, ice pack for 8 months of the year and some really incredible storms for 4 months out of the year. It's going to be very hard. On the other hand, whaling is out of fashion, and it can stay that way. There are valuable fishing stocks in parts of the Arctic Ocean, and again, we have to be watching after those, because if we've learned anything in the last 20 or 30 years, is that international fishing fleets can clean out a fishing resource faster than you can guess at. We don't even, we didn't even know much about the life cycle of the Atlantic cod off the Grand Banks until it was too late. And there was something like 1%, 10% left of the floors that were capable of breeding young scrod. So that's one reason why the cod won't come back. Well, the Icelanders, there's fishing grounds north of Iceland But again, if the international fishing fleets, especially not just Spanish trawlers, but see Chinese trawlers get in there, they'll vacuum out the whole area before we understand what the biology of that area was.
You've made a few mentions of this throughout the program today, John, and I appreciate it. I know that your values and mine align very strongly around a lot of political issues, and it's interesting to kind of hear a conservative put forward questions around ecology, climate, and of course preserving our heritage and natural resources. Maybe something you could help us understand a little bit better here is how come conservatives have a hard time articulating that in a way that's different from the left wing and would still capture the minds of and imaginations of right-wing people to think about conservation instead of basically a kind of paranoia around even leaving a footprint somewhere?
The American National Park System was first established by Teddy Roosevelt. He was the one who was really pushing it. Conservation is integrally a conservative thing. Stephen Harper put in more Canadian territory aside as parks and wildlife refuges than any other prime minister has ever done. Ecology and in conservation are at the center of conservative thought. If you're conservative, partly is you want to protect things and the way they are. That includes wildlife. We also know, of course, that in Canada, our first national parks were a result of the railroad, which again was Sir John A. Macdonald's dream.
And the National Railroad, having that fundamental structure, the fundamental backbone to our economy, I think those big ideas when it comes to conservatism are what's kind of missing with conservatism today. There's a way forward. There's certainly a way to get from where we are to where we could be. I mean, while Kennedy proposed landing on the moon, it was a conservative president who saw the moon landing in the form of Nixon. And so this is the question. Why can't between different administrations can there be a fundamental cooperation for those big picture items that would make Canada a better place, whether we're talking about programming at a social level or taxation, or of course at a more logistical level and a physical level, that building of infrastructure that will see this country improve and be able to assert its sovereignty?
Well, I think if you go back to Sir John A. Macdonald, reviled though some people might hold him, remember, he really had three platforms that were all integral to him. Law and order, equal for everybody. In other words, Canada was safe. Building an infrastructure so that Canada became a place for business. And the third part of those was also keeping the finances manageable. Keeping the budget limited. And remember, we had a very small economy back then. But again, that's part of it. And we now know that, say, like large sections of wilderness are actually part of our infrastructure. We need them. In fact, actually in Canada, they're really not appreciated. One of the points, again, a part of our national mythology that isn't there, but who's taking our school kids out on the land these days? Teaching them how to canoe, teaching them how to camp, teaching them how to ski in the winter, learning what the Canadian wilderness is like safely, but so that they've got a respect for it. And that's something that is more important than painting pictures about whales on school walls, but actually getting out there and listening, to loons, listening to a wolf howl. And that is a part of what that is sort of a natural legacy that every Canadian should be able to share in. But we also need infrastructure. We need finances that can support that. And of course, so we also need a country that's safe.
Which is becoming a rarer and rarer opportunity here and seems to be slipping away from us if we don't reinstill peace, order, and good government soon. John, as we kind of close out here, I just wanted to leave the floor open to you. What's on your radar as it seems like we're going to head down to a federal election soon? I mean, again, we're coming out of pandemic policy. The provinces are opening back up. There's been a talk of a vaccine passport. There's all sorts of crazy things going on. But what's on your radar as we kind of look into the next 2-3 months here? We're going to have a federal election likely. What do you think is going to be the top priority? What's going to happen there?
Well, I have a very jaundiced view about Justin Trudeau, but it's partly based on my own experience, personal direct experiences of the man. But basically, when he was first getting back into political life around 2004, he was invited to a debate at Concordia, and I was invited in to debate him. And it was supposed to be an academic debate. So in other words, I would, deliver my statement, he'd deliver his, I'd rebut his, he'd rebut mine. We'd both sum up, and of course the audience would vote the beginning at the end of the session, and whoever swayed the most people would have won. He turned up late, delivered a half-hour bromide full of all sorts of polemics, and left. And suddenly realized that he doesn't know the rules, doesn't know the material, and doesn't care. And I mean, there are some people who are running around wearing a baseball cap, make Trudeau a drama teacher again. He is a drama teacher. I mean, he's a lightweight. In 154 years, he is the least prepared and the weakest prime minister this country has ever had. So I'm actually praying he gets defeated. I mean, I might not like some of the choices, especially the Conservatives are offering, but we need another government, not him. And if you actually do care about the Liberals need time, in the wilderness to reinvent themselves. They've been a great party. They've had great leaders in the past. They certainly haven't got one now. Let them go off into the wilderness and rediscover their roots and then come back. But that's my hope. What has me worried right now, again, China, the possibilities of a mistake. There are some grounds for some true catastrophes in Africa, and especially with a major drought and some of the political violence that's going on underway. And again, no reporters are covering it, but we're looking at situations that could kill tens of millions of people. And the situation in the United States, I mean, who knows what to believe anymore, but the partisan bickering and the incompetence of the major parties, there is one point. I mean, I've studied political violence all my life, and the one point I'd like to make about it is that political violence slides in on a logarithmic curve. It really does. I mean, you see small warnings, and then all of a sudden there's a crisis right in front of you, and there's no way of avoiding it. And this is the situation I see now with China, with some of the things in Africa, but also with the United States. I mean, I hope our neighbors in the Great Republic, are not on a suicide run right now, but I have my doubts.
I do as well, but I guess all we can do is hope and pray. John, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your contributions. We'll have you on again soon. Just as a heads up, when I take my time to go on my honeymoon and everything else, I think we'll
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you very much. I think that we'll be leaving this in the safe hands of some of our regular contributors. So we'll be in touch about that. And I think our facilitators will be probably either Stuart or Aaron. So we'll figure that out when we get there.
Well, I do enjoy talking to you, but talking to Stuart again would also be a pleasure. So.
Absolutely. Well, I think there'll be a lot of material ongoing. I'll be gone for about 3 weeks, and I'm sure that Stuart and the election can be plenty of discussion with yourself throughout that time.
Right. Well, congratulations, and talk to you later.
Thank you so much, John. Well, we're going to take a few minutes here, and as we kind of close out the day, we're gonna walk through some of the comments that we had today. So right back to the beginning, the Albertan reminds us that our new Governor General is a Trudeau Foundation alumni mentor. Well, then I guess I spoke too soon. Well, I mean, I don't really know what to say to that. Like, I don't want more Trudeau money and things, and I don't want more Me Foundation stuff, going on around here. But at the same time, something I'm having to kind of swallow my pride on a bit is quite frankly being a less of a Pharisee and less of a Puritan about some of this stuff. So I mean, it's not that I have nothing good to say about my alma mater and that whatever else, but kind of to the point of what that scene in Monty Python's The Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, yes, they brought the roads. Yes, they brought the education. Yes, they stopped the barbarians. Yes, they made sure trade could happen and whatever. What have the Romans done for us? I used to be quite harsh and pharisaical about, for example, the post-secondary institution, particularly the university, to be clear, here in town. I'm dating somebody. Well, not dating. Was dating. I'm engaged, soon to be married to somebody who went there, and they're doing a lot better in their career than I am. And obviously that place gave them a good enough education to get to where they need to go, and lots of other people. And while I disagree with the funding model for it, and I disagree with the values being preached, I disagree with the posters on the wall and the rainbow flags all over the place, I disagree with all of those things all the time, every day. The very ground itself, if I had all the authority in the world and I was suddenly made tyrant of this town, I probably would have the ground itself exercised for ever being a part of some of these things. But there's still good people coming out of it. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? I believe is what my namesake said in the gospel, Nathaniel, a man in whom there is no guile. I'm not trying to be more full of guile, but maybe there's a place for me to honestly admit that, you know what, good things can come from bad places. Not where we would hope, but they can come from mediocre, lukewarm, not necessarily totally virtuous places. So we have to be careful with that, the Albertan. Somebody, of course, there we go. Claudette, she's a regular on our show here. Your ticket to GG is just be a CBC presenter. 5 of the last 8 have been. That's true. A lot of CBC personalities have been involved with Governor General, to the point where I wouldn't be surprised if Peter Mansbridge gets named next time. No, he's pretty old and he's white and he's straight. That wouldn't work. But nonetheless, Claudette isn't wrong that a lot of CBC people have been involved with the Governor Generalship. I have to concede something here. I like the idea of there being at least one, I don't even want to say if I want to say nationalized, but a news service that understands that its entire job is all of Canada, and Canada being a big place. Again, not sure if it needs to be subsidized by the taxpayer, but that its mandate is from Alert to Windsor, from Port Hardy to Halifax, right? Like that's its mandate. Its mandate is all of Canada, from sea to sea to sea, coast to coast to coast. And I would love to be involved with whatever that is. I would have loved to do that. I would have loved to have been a part of that as a kid or younger and gotten involved in it. I've always had a bit of a voice for radio sort of thing, and enjoyed talking with people online and that sort of thing. Well, in an interview setting, I mean. But I couldn't join the CBC. I couldn't do it. My values aren't there. Good things can come out of the CBC, I guess. The same point I was just making before, but my values aren't there. I really don't want to be a part of that. It makes me cringe, the idea of being a member of our national press, our federally funded press that people are forced to pay for. I don't like the idea of people being forced to pay for something. And even though I want to tell Canada's story, the real stories, the stories from Churchill, from Alert, from Yellowknife, from Whitehorse, from Leduc, little pieces of Canada, that are so much bigger than the supposedly more popular places of Canada. I'd love to do that. And zip around the country and do those interviews and maybe write opinion, maybe write news, whatever. That'd be amazing to have done that, especially over the last 10 years. But my values and the CBC, they don't mesh. And I do believe that something like that needs to exist. I don't think it should be taxpayer subsidized, but I'd throw that to the comments. You guys tell me what that would look like. I don't know if the Western Standard's going to figure that out, but if they do, they can tell me and I'll zip all over the place. I'd love to spend 2 years in each of those places with my family, have enough money for me and the family to move to each of these places, and that'd be amazing. Hope your new GG will be a change from all the government channels appointed the last 34 years. It had started when Rick Hansen, the man in motion, was overlooked for the GG's position. I agree that they should have put Rick Hansen in there. That would have been its own tokenism. Let's be clear. No offense to Rick Hansen, but maybe that tokenism was warranted, and it would have been a more inspirational one than some of the other tokenisms we've had. But here we are. We can't. We can't choose them all, and we can't win them all, I suppose. But in that case, we could have gotten somewhere. There was one actually just before it. Ken Scott pointed out that do we really need this? Was what he's trying to write when he was talking about the Governor General. I think John and I's discussion demonstrated pretty thoroughly why we need a Governor General versus a lot of other options. I'm a monarchist, but I'm also a monarchist who believes the Neckel resolution was wrong and that sort of thing. Like, I believe in peerages, and I believe in parishes and little fiefdoms and little duchies. Like, I think that Canada needs to be cut up again. It's the way that it's cut up now is garbage. I love British Columbia. I'm a British Columbian for sure, but the borders of British Columbia, the external ones, are actually pretty useless. The internal ones need a lot of work. If we were all still going to call ourselves British Columbians, but I happen to be from the Duchy of Prince George or from, the Dukedom of North Fraser or whatever, I would prefer that. I would love to say that I was a son of New Caledonia. It's like, that's where I'm from. I'm from, yes, I'm a British Columbian, but I was born in New Caledonia, and I'm not like those coasties down south. Like, I don't, I know what winter is, and I know how to shovel a driveway, and I know how to build a fence and whatever. And stable up the cows. Like, I know how to do that because I'm not from the coast. I'm not from down south. I'm not stuck in urbanism. I'm a New Caledonian. And so for me, that's what I see when it comes to the monarchy sort of understanding. I guess maybe it's a more European understanding of monarchy, is that kind of like the king is down the street. Not that the king doesn't have authority, but the king he's a bit of a laid-back philosopher king. He kind of strolls around, puffs his pipe, and, hands out free advice. And yes, he's the king, and yes, his family is the model of the nation to a point. But it comes from a more reserved place, and he's just not that concerned about it. Maybe the pomp and circumstance could calm down a bit, but he probably should have a half decent place to live where he can host people and that sort of thing. I don't know if he needs palaces upon palaces, but I like the idea of there being kings and princelings and dukes and duchesses and all that sort of thing, and there being a hierarchy in society that is for its own good, though. It's for its own good. It's not just for the sake of whatever. It's for its own good. And that it comes with less partisanship. But at the same time, I'm also a huge believer in there being, all but every neighborhood having an elected assembly, and that there be declensions of elected assemblies all the way up the line. That, eventually at the National Council, it's like, well, I mean, we have a democratic decision because literally, the 10 layers below us that have all sent their representative, which are only separated by 1 degree from each other, right? Till you get out to the 30 million people that we have in this country, 40 million. That would be how I'd solve that problem. But that's another debate for another time. But do we really need this? Well, I think we need it for now. We've got a couple of as Sheldon makes the point, you don't have the sickly sweet pseudo calming CBC voice. Hello and welcome. Today, the Minister of Finance spoke with the Prime Minister and told him we're out of money. Yeah, no, I don't sound like Bernie McNamee. I don't. He's got, he was properly trained. I was never trained. And my poor producers tried to put me through some training, but ever since I got engaged or was about to get engaged and was already planning the wedding and blah, 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 I have not had time to do that sort of thing. Let's see what else we got here. Daryl Letmer. Wow, we got a comment so big it hides my face. We do this. No, I'm just kidding. Canada's largest problem in teaching our history, it's mainly our school teachers and the CBC. Most teachers are socialists and anti-Canadian, or in the CBC's case, they're unable to make historical movies. We have like heroes like Samuel Benfield Steele and others like Sir Matthew Begbie Bailey, but we'll never learn about them unless we tear down their statues. I'm going to remove that comment, not from the stream, Daryl, but just from my face. Okay, thank you. You're a good commenter, Daryl. I like you. No, you got a point there. To a point, though, I think that here's a little hot take. It turns out that there's a lot of teachers who have a problem with the SOGI curriculum, so sexual orientation, gender ideology curriculum, gender identity, gender ideology. It is gender ideology, but the gender identity curriculum. And I happen to know for a fact that there are people agitating to get this thrown out of schools, and there are teachers who are left wing who do not want this SOGI stuff preached anymore. They're tired of it. They don't want to preach to their own kids, let alone the kids in their classroom, and they don't agree with it. They think it's not scientifically based. Obviously, being lefties, they don't think that there's something fundamentally wrong with some of it, which those of us to the right and more religious would. But we can agree on what we disagree with about SOGI, which is it must go. And so I would hold back on that. I think most people are at least pocketbook conservatives, and I think conservatives could win more votes by being pocketbook conservatives that also assert certain values that are just true. Okay, it doesn't matter which way your sexual proclivities swing, consent, of age, human being, being my disclaimers there, caveats. But the point being that, like, you just want a family, right? And monogamous. You just want a family. That is all you really want. If you're listening to this broadcast and you don't want a family, then honestly, at a certain level, I feel like you have no right to make any kind of policy decisions or have a vote in policy decisions. Family is it. That's all it is. You were born of parents. You did not conceive yourself, and you did not spring out of a hole in the ground. So the family is the fundamental building block of society. We have to build it. We have to make it easier to have a family than not have a family. We have to make it easier to be married and stay married than not. And so I guess what I'm trying to get to there is that when it comes to the teachers and the questions of their socialism, I think a lot of teachers are actually, especially when they get married and they have kids, they actually become slightly more socially conservative. They don't want their kids put into adult films or the viewership of adult people, right, in sexual stuff. They don't want that. They don't want their child to be fundamentally confused about their gender or their genitals or any of that stuff. They don't want that stuff. And so I think that the ultimate question is, you know, the fact of the matter is that most people, I think, are kind of pocketbook conservatives who can get on side with some social conservative values as long as they're presented in the right way, which is nobody wants their daughter to end up having to sell her body. Nobody wants their son addicted to drugs. Everybody wants their kids to have a good work-life balance. Everybody wants their kids to have as good of a life or better than they had. And everybody wants their grandchildren to grow up in a better world. That's what people want. There's nothing wrong with conservatives finding a way to articulate those ideas, even from a more socially conservative stance of virtue, faith, and family, or at least putting forward that the family must come first. And I'm going to say it once, I say it again. If you are someone listening to this broadcast and you think that somehow, some way, the world is supposed to be geared to you and your otherhood, which is a play on motherhood, right? But your otherhood, you're not going to be a father, you're not going to be a mother. You don't think it's your job to raise the next generation. You think that an urbanite single life is all that's good for you, and you don't care about anybody enough to marry them and suffer with them through what is the cross, but also the reward of family life. I honestly don't really want your vote or enfranchisement in any public policy decisions or debates whatsoever, except for how small exactly do you want your individual containers to be for your silly little consumeristic lifestyle when you go to the store that sells the very small individualistic containers, because going to Costco would be food that spoils for you because it's too much food. Yeah, I don't really want your vote and everything. You can get on the same train as Julie Payette that I was talking about earlier, as far as I'm concerned. But because you were not born of yourself, and you have a responsibility to make sure that this civilization continues. And so you can either help with that or you can get out of the way, would be my vote. But if you're interested in helping with it, do vote for the parties that are going to make it easier for that to happen and not harder. So that's my 2 cents on that. So I think that's about it for today's program. Had some stern things to say at the end there. Maybe that was good. Maybe that was bad. Whatever. Always send messages, comments, concerns to the show. You have me at all times, right? Giede at westernstandard.com. And just let us know how things are going. Of course, we've got Aaron and we've got Stuart on tomorrow. And we're going to talk with them about everything that's happening in British Columbia and the rest of Canada. Stay safe out there. Don't breathe in too much smoke if that's what's happening in your area. And yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain.